Hello, viewer. Now, I like to start off these little get-togethers of ours talking about some detail about the video game that doesn't really mean anything. I could talk about how F.E.A.R is in the running with the new Super Mario Bros. Series for most nonsensical title. I could talk about the weird genre it's going for, or even the comparison to Half-Life that we'll get to later. But the best place to start is to give my hats off to Jeff Orkin for the actual contribution to video gaming overall that he gave us, because F.E.A.R brings us something truly special, the best enemy AI I've ever seen. Instead of just getting in position and playing the shooting gallery peekaboo game like most FPSs, Monolith's team, and Day 1 for instance, designed a whole complex system of combat where the enemies will flank, they'll run incredibly fast, they'll rush forwards, and all at such a pace that it makes it hard to keep track of any of them, and it's an eye-opening level of challenge. It's a brilliant new world of artificial intelligence released in 2005. It's just too bad that didn't pass over to the actual game's writers. While F.E.A.R brings the world a bunch of nice sounding ideas and good concepts, it seems like the guys at Monolith didn't have all the pieces in place before they went off to the races. First of all, this game came out before subtitle options, and normally that wouldn't be a huge issue, except that most of the game's plot is handed out in radio communiques and phone messages that you have to bend your head to even have a hope of listening to. I'd be up for a boring ass scattered document trope just so I don't have to deal with this.
Next, from Aldous Bishop. Hey, it's Aldous. I read through those news clippings and I definitely think you're onto something. I'm going to see if I can track down some other people who lived or worked in the area during that time. Even a couple of interviews would help. I'll keep you posted. End of messages.
And the voice acting for these things is really odd and a bit charming as well, because these messages are brought to us by ArmaCam employees working on this top secret project, and they discuss burying the truth and the deadly consequences of their actions in the same tone that you'd ask a coworker where the rest of the birthday cake ended up.
I got your message, Genevieve. I think what Harlan is trying to say is that we should be leery of knee-jerk impulses. I understand there's some time pressures to consider, but we really need to be thinking strategically. Reopening the vault at this point strikes me as a dubious proposition, considering all that's happened. It's probable that we just be adding fuel to the fire.
The codec messages are actually worse than this, since the F.E.A.R team leader has a terrible voice actor who couldn't enunciate to save his goddamn life, which is a huge problem, since some of the juicier fluff text is buried in computer translations provided by him.
Bible wasn't made from Harlan Wade's DNA. There's an email from Wade about the subject being in an induced coma. Those ATC security codes killed Bishop because somebody didn't want him getting out.
I have no idea what's going on because I couldn't bloody well hear him, and he's supposed to be talking directly in Point Man's ears. Like, what the actual hell is up with his stupid earpiece? Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. It's an expectation that should have been had when you remember this guy is heading up the most ridiculous cliched mercenary group in video games, somehow having the clout to convince the government that they needed a top-notch military force with covert operators, top-of-the-line equipment, helicopters, tanks, and what have you, in order to take on threats specifically from supernatural beings like ghosts and aliens.
This is why nobody takes us seriously. Military clones.
Because a vampire army is totally gonna be stopped in its tracks by dual-wielding SMGs being shot at them. I know what Monolith was going for. They were trying to take a unique spin on the FPS by building a typical entry in the genre, but surrounding it by this weird-ass premise that doesn't really make any sense. The F.E.A.R operators are called in to stop a man called Paxton Fettel, some sort of psychic mercenary and apparently cannibal who appears to be psychically linked to a group of military-grade clones who are murdering a bunch of people who are apparently important, and so F.E.A.R has a job to do. Heading up this mission is a rookie totally new to actual combat and leadership in general, whose name is simply Point Man, and I do respect F.E.A.R for at least giving me a generic protagonist man with a name that I can actually remember. Yeah, that isn't his title. Point Man is actually his God-given name. Kind of like Rookie from Halo 3 ODST, if you can remember back that far in this channel's history. Now, since F.E.A.R's developers didn't have a good voice actor direction, it isn't surprising that all the characters are bland, mostly because they barely appear in the game at all. Imagine Titanfall 2's campaign if BT wasn't in it. And that's basically what you have here today, and what makes this problem worse is that Point Man here is another silent, faceless protagonist in a horror game, and after our talk with Dead Space, you already know why this never works. You need the characters' reactions to the strange, fucked up shit going on around them to immerse the player into the actual game scares. I know that you think having the main character as a blank slate will automatically slide the player themselves into their shoes, but no, that doesn't really happen. Do you really think that the Silent Hill quadrilogy would have been so great if the main characters were never on screen? Obviously not. So yeah, unfortunately this horror-fueled FPS isn't scary, partly because the plot is impossible to grasp from the lack of subtitles and difficult to hear dialogue, and the other thing is that the scares aren't consistent. The game doesn't go with having a constant atmosphere of tension and instead gives us a bunch of set pieces of vaguely scaring vignettes that are loosely tied together to what you are spending most of your time with, resulting in all the scares being reduced to left-field jump scares. And the jump scares don't work because again, the player doesn't know what's going on, so why should they have any idea of how to feel from being dumped into a nightmare hospital with floating muncher ghosts and the girl from The Ring hanging about? Yeah, it's a little fun to have these things about, and they do liven up the place, but they don't last, and the scares are so rarely found in the game that it can't make up for the game mainly being a typical FPS from the 6th generation of consoles. Well, to be more precise, F.E.A.R is the game that wants to be Half-Life in 2006. I'm actually kind of amazed, because F.E.A.R feels like a well-made Half-Life mod that evolved into its own game. I watched a Let's Play series of Half-Life, didn't play it myself, yet the two feel like long-lost twins. You can't imagine how much of the game is spent crouched down and punching your way through air ducts and ceiling pipes, around a game made entirely of dingy corridors that all look the same and are incredibly small, so you end up constantly clipping into corners and being annoyed every time you take a hard corner. The game is filled with jumping puzzles, awkward cliff walks, and that annoyingly old-school FPS style. And then there's the actual combat, which feels rightly Valve-inspired, since the typical soldiers you'll be facing all have amazing accuracy. Yeah, this game won't be getting to you based on the actual scares. It's mainly the combat with regular dudes that'll scare you to death, since they have the eyesight to peg your dopey ass from a mile away, and they can immediately spot you within 300 feet. Plus the graphics are admittedly pretty muddy, and without actual iron sight aiming, you aren't able to shoot them with the same precision, and then there's the damn dust effects, which are spectacularly awful. It's like throwing a sandy-colored blanket on your head and telling you to run down the stairs before you get kicked in the balls. The combat gets rightly terrifying, since the excellent AI of the enemies means you'll never know where they are or how many of them are there until they start yelling for reinforcements. The audio cues in this game are amazingly intuitive, and each shot can eat up like 5 to 8 of your health, and yes, this game does have a health bar somehow in the early year of 2006, just to show how long it took for that tradition to die. And while F.E.A.R does give you enough resources to never make you feel like you've hit a wall of impossible bullshit, this combat system will still keep you on your toes, looking over your shoulder and trying to plan ahead, all the while you've got guys you didn't see coming on your ass eating your health up. The best way to combat almost every situation is the game's well-known bullet time mechanic, which gives you a period of slow motion so you can get all of your bullets on the field before the enemies does, and you'll never understand how useful and required this mechanic is, because when everything is going at real time, enemies can cross the map in literal seconds and they are incredibly squirrely, so trying to get a beat on them is actually difficult. Plus, all this time, you aren't going to be fighting just faceless dudes, even though F.E.A.R has the best plot-based reasons for you to be fighting wave after wave of the same person all the time. Nope, just like Half-Life again, they have a respectable set of different enemies to fight, most of which can all go do themselves since they are ridiculously difficult to defeat. First is the Armored Soldier, who can tank about 15 shotgun blasts to the chest and body region. Later, you'll be meeting Armicham's legitimate legit ninja division, who are even worse because they're invisible 75% of the time, and they attack by slapping you in the face at high speeds for high damage. And then, when you're invading the offices of Armacam, they get desperate enough to send in flying X-shaped robots for some reason, and then there's the king of awfulness themselves, the fighter robots, who are even more tanked up than the armored soldiers. They have more impressive weaponry, and you'll never see them coming. At the end of the game, Monolith even stacks 2 of these assholes back to back because they just love their players ever so much. All the while, you're shooting up everything in sight and probably max pain dodging through every conceivable surface known to man. The game is essentially another chase the antagonist plot that never gets satisfactorily resolved. Hell, the game takes such a hands-off vibe to its own plot that for like 3 of the 10 chapters, you lose Paxton Fettel into another zip code and your point man ass is just dicking around and rifling through people's desks. Halfway through, you do find this guy, Norton. He's the worst character in video games, second only to the god-awful Bowser Jr., because he's one of those dickheads who do the survival of the fittest thing, tricking the protagonist into repeatedly doing things to give themselves an advantage and then running away instead of taking responsibility for their actions, which end up kicking the protagonist right in the ass. And likewise, and super unfortunately, Point Man never gets to settle the score with Norton as he gets shot by the king of Armacam while they're dealing with the company's past. On the surface, Armacam appears to be a legitimate company conducting themselves in military science, but as you rest your dick on every available surface and punch all of the phones for not playing some soothing girl of Ipanema, you start figuring out that Armacam was working on the psychic mercenary Paxton Fettel project and then trying to bury it. There's a faction within the company trying to stop the plan to uncover it because they're scared of the thing they had made. Shortly after, you figure out that Armacam had experimented on a girl called Alma to birth the psychic commander, by inducing her into a coma for years, impregnating her during that time, and then forcing her to give birth while in the coma, but the trauma of the childbirth broke that grip and she ended up frying some people's asses with psychic powers before being sealed away in an Armacam vault. Yeah, it's pretty fucked up stuff that should have been in the game more, instead of backloaded right onto the end of it. It's such an issue that this revelation managed to come into the game after Point Man shot Paxton Fettel in the face, ending the dalliances with the clone commandos. The last chapter of this game is nice enough and a good way to end this game of Shooty Man and Jump Scare Town, but it just didn't save it. This happens because despite Alma being loosed from her cage, the player can already guess that their character is going to be safe from the catastrophe no matter what happens, even as the literal apocalypse is happening around them and all this extra dimensional ghosts in the world can't stop that, because video games have to get their protagonists to the end credits. They aren't just gonna drop dead halfway through the chase. So after a few checkpoints and instant deaths, Point Man escapes the vault and the facility to make it to the surface just in time to see the city get nuked by Armacam's cleanup crew, and the F.E.A.R commandos fly off to safety. Or so they thought. I'm not sure why Monolith thought they were going to get an automatic sequel to their game to end it on a ballsy cliffhanger, but maybe it was just wishful thinking for a game that had some nice ideas. The big issue is that F.E.A.R is trying to do 2 different things simultaneously, where its inspiration Half-Life only did the one thing, be a revolutionary environmental story alien shooter, while F.E.A.R is trying to have the same type of cutting-edge shooter alongside some horror, which muddies it completely. The shit your pants moments put in being reduced to ooh and ah distractions, which isn't helped by the plot being let down by its total lack of presentation quality. At least if the game had subtitles, I would have been able to follow along. Instead, it feels like this game is trying to recite Hamlet in German, and looking at me to take notes, and I'm just shaking my head dumbfounded at everything it's saying. I can respect the game for trying some truly harrowing and fun balls-to-the-wall shooting gameplay that'll terrify you way more than Alma could in her nightmares, but there's no story or plot to wrap the gameplay around in order to get me immersed in anything intriguing. Maybe these things will be hammered out in the sequel like Dead Space 2, but first there are a couple expansion packs that were made alongside this, because if F.E.A.R was any more like Half-Life, then its true title would be HL 2.5 The Later Years. But I'm not too sure about them, obviously. Anyway, let's finish up this blast from the past with a final scoreboard. and a dark and gloomy victory for gamers. Thanks for watching.